Hey everybody, it's Ed. Before we get started, I wanted to thank two brand new Patreon supporters, Shad Mirab and Cortland Wolf. Both of these guys signed up to support the podcast via Patreon, and you can learn more about that at mountainandprairie.com/support. Secondly, I wanted to make sure that you're all aware of a certain page on the Mountain and Prairie website, the events page. I keep that up to date with all the different events I'm doing throughout the year, and I've got some really cool ones coming up in the next few months. First on the agenda in about 2 weeks from now is the Old Salt Festival up in Montana, and then I've got the Strenuous Life Retreat at the Zapata Ranch here in Colorado, and then I've got a float down the Green River in Utah through Gates of Lodore and Dinosaur National Monument. I add stuff to that all the time. I've got another event hopefully coming up in Texas a few months out that I'll be adding. A lot of cool live podcasts, a lot of trips. And so I'd encourage you guys to go to mountainandprairie.com/events to keep an eye on all that stuff. I'd love to see you at some of the events. Thanks so much.
This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson.
My guest today is Doug Peacock. Doug is a legendary environmentalist, writer, filmmaker, and grizzly bear advocate. He's the co-founder of two conservation nonprofits, Round River Conservation Studies and Save the Yellowstone Grizzly. Doug was also the inspiration for the character George Washington Hayduke in his friend Edward Abbey's classic novel, The Monkey Wrench Gang. And to top it all off, he's the author of many classic books, including Grizzly Years in Search of the American Wilderness, and his most recent award-winning book, Was It Worth It? A Wilderness Warrior's Long Trail Home, published by Patagonia Books. Doug was born and raised in Michigan, where he grew up obsessed with nature and the outdoors. As a young man, he was drafted into the Vietnam War, where he served as a Green Beret combat medic, an experience that placed him squarely in the middle of devastating violence towards his fellow soldiers, as well as civilian men, women, and children. In 1968, he returned home from Vietnam spiritually broken, mentally unwell, and physically debilitated with malaria. Not knowing where to turn, he headed deep into the wilderness of Yellowstone National Park by himself, where he formed an unlikely bond with the Yellowstone Grizzly Bear. Eventually, he recovered both physically and mentally, and to this day, he credits the grizzly with saving his life. He spent the last half-century repaying his debt to the grizzly bear, aggressively fighting for their protection and recovery in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem and beyond. I met up with Doug in Aspen, Colorado, where he was in town for a reading of Was It Worth It? At Aspen's only bookstore, Explore Booksellers. Even though I could have talked to Doug for many, many hours, we managed to jam a lot of stories into this conversation. Some of the topics we discussed include why Doug does not carry a gun in grizzly country, why it's important for humans to love and protect a creature as powerful and even dangerous as a grizzly bear, his friendships with Edward Abbey, Yvon Chouinard, Jim Harrison, and others, and how each of those high-voltage personalities helped to elevate the others. The death and secret burial of Edward Abbey, why climate change is such a threat to grizzly bears, the challenges and financial realities of a life dedicated to environmental advocacy, his greatest source of pride and greatest disappointment, what's giving him hope right now, and Doug reads several passages from Was It Worth It? Even as he's getting on up there in age, today at age 81, you can still feel the fire in Doug's spirit, and his passion for grizzlies is palpable. I was honored to have the opportunity to chat with Doug, and I loved his book, Was It Worth It? I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did.
Well, Doug, it's an honor to be sitting here with you. You know, your name on this podcast that I do, that I just started randomly, your name has been coming up since episode number 1. Well, I always ask people about books that they admire and people they admire and kind of their heroes. And since day 1, 7 years ago, your name is at the top of the list that everybody keeps. And so it's really awesome to be sitting here with you. And I appreciate you taking the time because I know you got a ton going on.
My privilege, man.
Well, thank you. And I was thinking, there's so many things I want to talk to you about. And I was thinking maybe the easiest way to start is tell me about this picture on the front of your amazing book, Was It Worth It? Why are you holding that spear?
Well, that's because I'm walking point on a polar bear expedition. Doug Tompkins, my buddy, he's gone now, but he took this picture. And it was cold, so I got about 7 jackets on because the pack ice, we were way up in the Canadian Arctic, you know, which is on a little island named Somerset, uninhabited, but it had a fjord that was open, and the fjord was full of beluga, 800 beluga whales and some narwhals too. And the guy that wanted us to come along and look out for polar bears was like a whale guy, you know, so animal communications, you know, singing to orcas and that kind of stuff. But there were polar bear around, and, you know, the law up there, you got to carry a big firearm, big bore. I wouldn't go for that. That's just not, you know, I don't consider it fair play to invade the land and habitat of an endangered animal and then blow them away if things don't unfold to your favor. So I decided that an 8-foot-long spear with a home-forged spearhead would be okay. You know, the theory being that it's a pike. You know, you'd anchor it in the ground or the ice, and, you know, the charging bear would impale itself on its narrow chest. And the odds are, of course, that you'd lose 99 out of 100 times, but I didn't have to do it, fortunately. Yeah. We ran into polar bears, but they kept their distance.
Well, I love that story. And then it takes me back to a story that you recounted in Grizzly Years, and then you tell again in this book of kind of when you made that decision that it wasn't fair to be on Grizzlies' ground with their, you know, with a firearm, and kind of when you made that decision that you'd spend enough time shooting guns. Yeah,
this is, I'll just read this passage.
Oh, great.
Just a paragraph. But this is from it's actually the inscription for Grizzly Years, my first book. And I had just encountered grizzlies, you know. Coming back from Vietnam, I went to camp out in Yellowstone, you know, with a high fever from a malaria attack, and I ran into grizzlies. And at first, I wasn't sure they were real. I just see these huge prints and things. They were. Yeah. And, you know, towards the end, I had to make peace with the alpha bear in this little gathering of grizzlies. The big bear stopped 30 feet in front of me. I slowly worked my hand into my bag and gradually pulled out the magnum. I peered down the gun barrel into the dull red eyes of the huge grizzly. He gnashed his jaws and lowered his ears. The hair on his hump stood up. We stared at each other for what might have been seconds, but felt like hours. I knew that I was not going to pull the trigger. My shooting days were over. I lowered the pistol. The giant bear flicked his ears and looked off to the side. I took a step backward and turned my head towards the trees. I felt something pass between us. The grizzly slowly turned away from me with grace and dignity and swung into the timber at the end of the meadow. I caught myself breathing heavily again, the flush of blood hot on my face. I felt my life had been touched by enormous power and mystery. And that's the last time I carried a firearm in the grizzly country.
I was wondering, another story that you've told many times, but I think it's so powerful, if you could talk about how Yellowstone came into your brain. And that's particularly that story about carrying the map with you in Vietnam and how that was really such a important thing that kind of kept you grounded while you're over there. And then it led you, when you got home, led you to, you know, go and make that really your home.
I was a Vietnam Special Forces medic during the Tet Offensive. And the Tet Offensive, it was just carnage to civilians. The NVA and the Viet Cong would burn down villages and herd them out. Our helicopters and jets machine gunned them down. You know, I just saw a lot of carnage. And I'm just going to read a sentence.
Please.
The most indispensable wilderness experience in my life arrived quite accidentally in Yellowstone National Park during the decade after I returned from Vietnam. Accidental because I stumbled into the park lodgepole's pine forest at the peak of a hallucinatory malaria paroxysm. That experience can't be replicated today because of human crowding. It occurred long enough ago that the National Park Service didn't especially think a wacko hiding out in their backcountry was worth looking for. And that was the combat vet Edward Abbey met in 1968, upon whom he later based the fictional character of George Washington Haydock. With its wildlife, wilderness, and thermal areas of refuge from deep snows, I considered Yellowstone's backcountry a paradise and wanted to indulge in pockets of it without interference from the outside world. This was still possible in a Yellowstone long before talk of bringing in fast food and the internet to National Park Service campgrounds. It also meant I had to hide out like an escaped POW might have attempted in Vietnam.
It's so powerful the way that you found this community, and completely by yourself. You went out there and you were alone. I've been reading a lot by this author, Sebastian Junger. You probably heard him. He wrote Perfect Storm and that kind of thing.
Yeah, of course.
And he wrote a book called Tribe, which I really admire. I never served in the military, but Sebastian Junger did a lot of work over in Afghanistan as an embedded journalist. And this book is about how when these veterans come home from Afghanistan, they have PTSD, and his theory is that it's because of a lack of purpose and a lack of community. And when I read your story, it seems to me that you found this unbelievable purpose with the Grizzlies, but you also found a community, which I think is really unique, that you connected with these animals that are kind of human-like in a lot of ways. I mean, do you agree with that? Am I way off there?
No, the grizzly bear has a lot, that's the indigenous people on this continent recognize the grizzly bear was someone from whom they could learn things, like where the food was at the right time of year. And, grizzly bears, when they cuff their cubs when they mess up, they snore when they sleep. And a skinned bear of any species looks uncannily like a human being.
Yeah.
They didn't miss any of that. And at the same time, being a huge omnivore, the biggest one on this continent, it's a force with which you have to deal. You can't just go diddy-bopping through the meadows in grizzly country, thinking about your girlfriend or your portfolio, because there's something out there that if it wanted to, could kill and eat you at any time. They don't, but, you have to know when you're out in grizzly country, you think about where the grizzlies are all the time, and that it allows you to externalize, in my case, my demons a lot from Vietnam and stick them out where I could look at them. And
how long did it take you to find some level of peace? How many seasons?
Within half a dozen, because I started filming grizzlies full time about then. And, I decided I was just going to film grizzlies south of Canada. And I felt like I was a 1800 ethnographer, maybe, making a last film of the Mandan Indians before the smallpox hit the villages on the upper Missouri. That's what I was going to do. I thought the grizzlies were going away. And, in Yellowstone, they looked like it because they were slaughtered. The Park Service closed the dumps in the late 60s and early 70s. And all of the bears in Yellowstone who had been eating garbage at Park Service open pit dumps for 80 years went into town sites and garbage and picnic grounds and campgrounds. And there were, 170 were shot, according to Frank Craighead, in 5-year period in Yellowstone. That's the whole population again.
That's so crazy.
And, and I knew that because I was living in the backcountry like the wacko I was. I wasn't flying with a plane once every 2 weeks. I was down there on the ground looking for grizzlies. And sometimes, you might spend a week without finding a grizzly in those days.
When did you realize that your work filming the grizzlies was making a difference? Because I imagine when you started, it was kind of desperation, like you said, like these things are going to be wiped out. I just got to get in here. But when did people start taking note of what you're doing?
In the first couple of years. First year, I got some amazing footage. The second year, I got even more. But that allowed, I started giving the people that wanted to hear about grizzlies, and I had a little movie footage to show. So I started giving lectures, and I bargained my way on, national ABC News, the Today Show, and, lots of Sesame Street. I mean, I was
really,
I had some rare footage that no one else had because This is the only footage really of wild grizzlies. If the grizzly bear knew I was there, I didn't film. Mm-hmm. I never filmed from roads or around other people, ever. And what you get today are grizzlies on roadsides, and, they're quite aware of you. And it shows.
Yeah.
But I had enough footage to bargain my way, with Brokaw and a few other people like that.
One thing that I find interesting is, you take doing these films and filming these animals, when somebody who's never seen it before sees these images, it's pretty, you got to be kind of a soulless maniac if you don't feel some connection to these animals, particularly like a mother with some cubs, because it looks so human-like. I mean, it's very strange, the connection there. And so I would guess that the more times than not, when people saw your films, they piqued their interest. They went a little bit deeper, and then they began caring, which is the first step towards conservation. But then on the other side of things, you strike me and as somebody who is willing to go the opposite end and fight if needed, not be positive about loving and telling these great stories, but also you're willing to fight, and you've done it. And so how was that kind of balance between the positive, look at these beautiful animals, with your potential, I don't know if it was an urge, but your potential to be willing to mix it up if you have to?
Well, you spend enough time with those animals like today, and you see they really are going away. They're being killed to excess by the agencies, by the Federal Wildlife Service and by the states of Idaho, Montana, who have just got treacherous, murderous laws passed in their legislatures, all three states. You can smell the hate seething from, these legislative committees. Mm-hmm. They hate wolves. They hate grizzlies. And they don't know shit about them. And, what you don't know, you tend to fear, and you hate what you fear. And, Ed Abbey and I were close friends for over 20 years, despite being cantankerous sons of bitches, mainly because of our value. We knew the value of wilderness and the need to fight to defend it. So I've always been a fighter. I mean, you can argue it came straight out of Vietnam, but I didn't particularly value my life that much. I didn't care about threats and getting killed or mauled. And, it just carried through. I could be as bold and reckless as I needed to be to protect these bears. I'm still at it, and it's 50 years, man.
50 years.
Yeah.
One thing that stuck out in some of the videos I was watching is that, you obviously you love the bears, but in hearing you talk, and then hearing some of your friends talk, like, for example, Terry Tempest Williams, they speak so eloquently about how, yes, the bears are important. We're here to save the bears, but by saving these bears, by learning to accept and appreciate and love and respect these animals that could kill us in any moment, it can make us more open and kind of a better citizen of the world if we can learn.
Well, it's perfectly true, though. I mean, and if you save the grizzly, you're going to save everything else that's there too.
When did you realize that? Because I think, initially...
Real early.
Early, okay.
Real early.
I don't know. I just feel like with all this conservation stuff, I think people don't really see the ripple effects. Yes, the grizzly's important, but I think it makes us all just better humans.
The grizzly bear really opens your mind. It's enforced humility, if you will. It's the quickest exit I know from civilization is going to grizzly country, because you're not the dominant creature. There's one animal in our woods and mountains left that can, that makes Homo sapiens look like second-rate citizens. It's the only animal that can really do that instantly, and that's its great value too.
Yeah,
it's the people that hang out with grizzlies and fight for grizzlies are going to know that.
I'll tell you, just preparing for this interview and really immersing myself in a lot of the videos and films that you have made or that you've starred in, it gave me an appreciation that I didn't have previously, and that was just in 3 or 4 days of it, and so it's powerful stuff. Wonderful. And my career is in conservation, water and land, but it's it kind of made me think maybe I've been missing something, looking at the wrong thing for a while. One of the things that also comes through in this book that I think is really interesting is, in just your life story, is that you went to Yellowstone to be by yourself and to kind of reset. And, for a long time, I think people, it's not crazy to say you were a loner. But then on the other side, you've got these amazingly strong friendships with so many just amazing people who have done their own thing. Everybody from Jim Harrison to, obviously Edward Abbey to Rick Ridgway, who's been on this podcast. Can you talk about how those friends that you made helped you become better at what you do, better at the conservation work that you do?
Well, they're just really strong examples of one thing or another. I mean, Peter Matheson,
mm-hmm.
and, I took Jim Harrison camping a lot, the closest he ever came to. There were gourmet meals and lots of Bordeaux around the campfire, of course. But, those are the amazing men, and, I have a life of my own. It kind of stands up along. And, we go on trips together, too, to wild places.
Sure.
And, that really cements it. It's still the belief in the strength of, I say wilderness, but it doesn't have to be wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be a strong enough experience to draw you out of yourself. That is mutual in all our lives. We've got something bigger than ourselves that are worth fighting any way we can, all the way.
And is that what the mutual respect is? Because I would imagine that a lot of, in order to be like you and in order to be like Ed Abbey, Jim Harrison, you're kind of a rebel. They're not following the normal rules. Yvon Chouinard is not following the normal rules.
No, he pissed on him from great heights when he gave away his billions.
Yeah, he did. I mean, that was the ultimate. But did you guys, I mean, I know you've written about you and Ed Abbey would clash, but it seems like that's a lot of energy to have all you guys that are somewhat rebels.
I know.
How does that work as like real friendship? Because I could see it could be like matches and gasoline if you don't watch it.
Well, like Ed Abbey, we had mutual cantankerous moments. But over 20 years, when it counts, you come together. I was the one person, if Ed was lost in the wilderness, that he'd try to get to come look for him.
Mm-hmm.
And, when Ed died, I was there, I was actually alone with him most of the last 4 hours. And then I buried him a couple of days later. So, that's a big deal. He had requests for his funeral and burial, and I saw, along with my friends like Jack Leffler, that, they were carried out.
There was a part when you're writing in this book about Ed Abbey, and you're talking about Rick Ridgway, who was with Doug Tompkins when he died, and then you're talking about your time with Ed Abbey, and there's a part where you say you got very, very close to death with Ed Abbey, and it took you a while to kind of come out of it.
Oh, yeah.
And that Rick was experiencing a similar thing, and he writes eloquently about that in his most recent book. I mean, you can't speak for Rick, I guess, but like, how did you come out of that? Because, I mean, you dug his grave, you laid down in it, looking up at the sky, making sure it fits, making sure it's got a good view.
It was good enough,
But I mean, and then you've also written about the importance of ceremony and how Homo sapiens these days don't have ceremonies like they used to. So I'd love to hear kind of how you got out of that.
Well, I wrote a little bit about that at the end of my Siberian tiger trip with Doug Tompkins, Yvon Chouinard, Rick Ridgway, and Jeb Ellison, and Tom Brokaw.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's
yep.
it. I have to look at the picture and see who was there.
Yeah, I was looking at that picture. I'm going to grab my copy.
At the very end, we ran into this tiger track whose scent I got down and smelled. And it turned out it was the same tiger that a decade later killed and dismembered a poacher who had wounded it. I'll just say, and we were with a Russian biologist named Dmitry.
Mm-hmm.
So we, down in the Amba River, a branch of the Beacon in the Russian Far East, we crossed a trail of a young but mature male tiger. The tiger is doing scrape marks and scent marks, especially on trees. And Dmitry, stops us and he says, "We stop at such a tree. A bear, also attracted to the strong scent, has rubbed off the bark. I get down on my knees and press my nose against the bare trunk. I wonder who this young but freshly dominant male tiger will become. The pungent fettor of tiger fills my nostrils, and, just for seconds, I travel with the big cat, orange and black stripes flashing barely perceptibly through the sea of green undulating cone fern into the wild and predatory world that not so very long ago was my own. It turned out that tiger was the subject of the book Tiger, which was an after the fact, that didn't have a lot of details on it because Dimitri, the one man who really knew, that tiger had had a stroke.
Oh, okay.
And couldn't help. And let me just read this.
Please.
Another decade later, after many trips and half a world away, I get an email from my dear friend Rick Ridgway, who has just been sharing an adventure with Doug Thompson, Jeb Ellison, and Yvonne Chenard in Chile. Doug and I flipped in a double kayak in cold water. Jeb and the others did an absolutely valiant effort to get us in. Doug died of hypothermia, and I just made it barely. 3 months later, Jeb, Rick, and I, they came down to the desert to have a last ceremony with me, to say goodbye in our pagan way anyway. 3 months later, Jeb, Rick, and I squat around a roaring mesquite fire deep in the desert wilderness near the Mexican border. We pour wine down our throats and spit exploding whiskey into the fire. We howl at the owls and porwills and laugh and weep in the flickering light. We grill our thick, bloody steaks and toast our friends, alive and departed. A meteor flashes out of Cassiopeia. After Doug died in Chile, Yvonne pulled me aside in California at Doug's memorial and told me Rick had gone over to the other side with Tompkins into death and hadn't made it all the way back yet. I did the same thing with Ed Abbey. Much the same way as I had walked as far into death with Ed Abbey as I could. It took me a long time to come back to the living. That next morning, Jib, Rick, and I bury all traces of our camp, pack up and drive into the mountain range. All three of us strike across the Bajada, aim for a distant volcanic peak, and drop our packs beyond the rim of basalt. We are here for an honoring ceremony. This is the grave of Edward Abbey, where three friends and I buried him 27 years ago. Doug Tompkins is buried in South America, but today he will be here with us. It is also the anniversary of the My Lai massacre that I unknowingly witnessed on my last day in Vietnam, flying up the South China Sea coast. A year later, the photographs in Life magazine changed my life. Jib reads a poem he has written to his dearest friend. Rick and I are carrying offerings. I leave Doug a Zuni bear effigy in memory of the kayak trip the two of us took on the Queen Charlotte Islands in coastal British Columbia looking for big bears. Rick speaks softly, telling the mountain about Doug's love of beauty. We grieve and laugh, pouring a little Mexican beer on Ed's grave for old time's sake. A pair of turkey vultures soar overhead, headed out into the vast Bajada below. It is our Day of the Dead.
That was so powerful. I mean, when I was reading the book, I underlined that whole passage. And after having the pleasure of meeting Rick, just such a great tribute, I feel like. And that brings me to another question. You've seen death in so many different ways, and it's been a kind of this constant, the threat of death, and then actually seeing it has just always been a through line. How did having children change you, if at all? I mean, did it at all? I mean, you still go on these trips with no, you're not carrying a gun in bear country, whether it's grizzly or polar bears. But did parenthood change you at all?
Oh, it sure, yeah, it really did. The one image I cannot bear are dead children. And I once, actually early in that book, described, I suffered from witnessing too much collateral damage. That cowardly phrase they used to describe the pile of small, dismembered bodies after a botched airstrike. And my kids have been wonderful to me, and Laura comes all the way out here just to hold my hand.
Well, I had the pleasure of meeting her a minute ago. So I've got 2 young daughters, and you hear all these cliches about parenthood, but they're cliches for a reason, I think, because it really did. It shook me out. I mean, I was doing kind of bullshit work and, selling ranches to rich people. And soon after I had my kid, I decided to go into conservation work. And that's partly influence of people like you, reading and seeing what you've done. And so that brings me to another question, is that people like me, I'm 45, but they look at you and your generation, whether it's Tompkins or Ed Abbey or Jim Harrison, across this full spectrum, they look at them as motivation and as an example of how you can use your career and your life for something better than just trying to rake in as much money as possible. Did you have anybody like that you were looking up to? I mean, was there anybody when you decided or when you ended up on this path, who did you look to as a mentor, or if anybody at all?
Probably not. I was kind of out there alone with the Grizzlies.
Yeah.
And I just found if I wasn't doing it, thinking about how someone should do it. But they weren't. And they just kept pushing me along. I was chairman of the board of Brown River Conservation Studies for 25 years. And we mainly protected indigenous lands, preserving, sometimes creating wilderness areas like 30, 35 million acres. And that's a big deal. And then when the Grizzlies were having the most recent trouble in 2016, the Federal Wildlife Service delisted the grizzly. I founded Save the Yellowstone Grizzly. Mm-hmm. And, we definitely can't have me running things because I'm incapable of all of that stuff. I can't do it. I can't ask for money. I'm awful. But we got to raise enough money to hire an executive director, to carry on and do the work properly. And I'm getting, I'm getting gimped up now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how time just flies by like that. I think a lot when I'm putting this podcast out of people that are listening, and I think there's a lot of people that are doing some job that they don't particularly like, and they want to do something that has more purpose to it. And they see somebody like you and they're like, oh, well, he's got it made. He's publishing all these books. He lives in Montana, splits time between the desert and Montana. But I would imagine that there were you had more than your fair share of tough times.
No, there's a price to pay.
Yeah. And so could you talk about, I don't know whether it's a financial challenge. I mean, some of the real world things, because Doug Peacock is larger than life, but there was times where I imagine this was kicking the shit out of you a little bit. Give us a reality check of what sacrifices.
Well, the reality is I lucked out. I made movies. I got some money for Peacock's War. I got a Guggenheim grant and a Lannan Foundation grant. And they all came at the right time. I mean, I don't make much money. Mm-hmm. Just don't do anything that's worth anything. You make, dimes on your books. I don't know what, a little bit, but not much. My friends helped me with Save the Yellowstone Grizzly. The Patagonia people have been really, really generous with mm-hmm. my movie work and my legal work. Mm-hmm. I'm suing the government right now. With the kids, I just lucked out. Every time I needed a dime, somebody sent me a mystery check.
Really?
Yeah. It's just luck.
Well,
nothing noble.
So you've been at this 50 years. And when you think about grizzlies right now, what is the issue that keeps you up at night? I mean, what is the main thing that you feel like is the most pressing thing facing us now?
Unfortunately, it's the states and the Federal Wildlife Service who are killing grizzlies so easily. It's unforgivable. I wrote a long article about the mother grizzly and 2 little cubs of the year that was killed near Tetonia, Idaho, right mm-hmm. across from Jackson Hole. Yeah. And my friends saw it, and they generously, financed legal work. And I hired a law firm. And we, subpoenaed all the Information Act stuff, and they recklessly slaughtered that poor family into extinction. Mm-hmm. And the family never did anything wrong. There were no threat to people or their property. 2 little cubs of the year, and they look like females to me. I don't really know, but, they're no threat to human beings, human safety. And, they killed them anyway. And they also acted illegally. The Federal Wildlife Service, their authorization was arbitrary and capricious. And the state of Idaho was absolutely criminal. They violated, Fed said, you can't kill that cub. And they killed him anyway. And just a little goddamn cub. Anyway, so I just announced our intention to sue in an article last week, published in Mountain Journal, I think. But,
Yep.
So, I'm going to see that through, and I have to do fundraising. And even though I'm awful, I can't ask for money. I just never could.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a failure at that, but I've got a crew that'll back me up, and we're going to pursue that. And we've got a movie that's almost in the can. It's a sequel to The Beast of Our Time.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, kind of a sequel, It can stand alone. But it's got, Jeff Bridges doing the narration and Bill Payne, doing the music again. And we also found an underpass of I-90 that bears use.
Oh, okay.
And we're trying, we have to work with departments of transportation, so it's rough. But anyway, originally I hired Lance Craighead to kind of supervise it because of all of his experience, and he's still on it. So we're just going to keep pushing that one because we need to get grizzlies from Yellowstone to the glacier ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And to do that, I-90 is the absolute barrier. It stops everything.
Well, and I'll put a link on the webpage to the first film because I think it did an awesome job of really showing these issues. And another issue that I knew a bit about, but I was far from informed as I should have been, was the white bark pine and how climate change has wrecked that. And so could you give an overview of, because I think that graph you have in the video, which people can watch.
Well, it's just a direct correlation
between, as direct as could be.
Temperatures and white bark pine decline to the point where white bark pine nuts are no longer viable food for grizzlies. And it used to be the most important food in Yellowstone. Mm-hmm. In 1902, there was a warming trend in Yellowstone. By, say, 2008, 2009, all you had to do is look up at the tops of mountains. They're all red. So they just went away. And that's more than a decade and a half ago. It's because the high altitude white bark pines, a beetle couldn't go up there and live inside the bark in the wintertime because the temperatures got down to 30, 35 below zero for a couple of days. Well, that's no longer the case. And they can overwinter. And so they killed all the mature. And it takes white bark pine, sometimes 50 to 80 years to begin to produce cones that have the edible nuts that the bears eat. They're all gone. I mean, there's a handful here and there, but that's it. It's not a viable food source. And it's absolutely direct result of global warming, climate change. I thought, it's the thing that probably hooked me in to climate change. I've been an advocate for over 30 years. And I remember Thomas Bianca, who was a Hopi, back in the 70s and 80s, telling Ed and I, the weather sure has been strange lately. And, that's what he was talking about. And he was right on, That's a long time coming.
Definitely a long time coming. Well, and I thought what was interesting, and the film made it very clear that because the bears don't have that food source anymore, that's why there's so many more interactions with humans, which gets them killed.
Yes.
And because they used to stay up high.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize
it's hunting season when the white bark nuts used to be harvested by bears, which meant especially females with young, to whom the pine nuts are especially necessary because of survivalship of cubs and, nutrition of cubs.
Yeah.
And also kept the mothers with cubs up high away from hunting seasons, because the white bark pine thrive at 8,000 feet.
Yeah.
And burn out at about 9.
Yeah, and then just the nutritional components that are in those seeds, they're a ton of fat, proteins.
Exactly.
Really interesting. That film was amazing. If you were, this is a hypothetical question, but if you were 25 years old right now and you were getting started in your career, just, wanted to devote it to conservation, just in general, where would you focus your energy?
You know, in the wilder, the better. The more wilderness centered, the better. But, I normally tell people, start in your backyard. What would you really know? I know. I happen to live in grizzly country on the edge of Yellowstone, but if I were here, it'd be slightly different. Also, it'd be nice to figure out someday how to get a few grizzlies down to Colorado.
Yeah, we need some.
I spent the early 90s looking for grizzlies down in the San Juans mostly. They were down there, but only till then. Mm-hmm. And the sign just kind of dried up.
You strike me as very realistic, but I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but you wouldn't be doing this work if you weren't an optimist. I mean, you're not just... I think you're a very realistic optimist. But what do you tell people who are just like, we're screwed? They're dumping, we're dumping all this stuff into the air.
I might agree with their point of view, but I wouldn't quit fighting, never. I mean, the evidence is bleak. You look at around us. We're not doing much about climate change. You want me to read a little bit?
I'd love to. Please.
Chapter? This is from the last few pages of the book. I'm not going to read everything, but I'll read some. When it is indeed our time to walk off stage with the mammoths, what might be the measure of our character at the end of our tour? After peering into the abyss, how do we behave? There is great joy in doing the toll of the world, fighting for wild causes, saving pieces of the magnificent natural world. There's plenty of work. Do your job with decency and an open heart. Love your brothers and sisters in all actions and all relationships. Speak the truth. Extend your innate empathy to distant tribes and strange animals. This is a little pedantic, but there's only one chapter in the whole book. Join the tribes in their dignified defense of native rights. An indigenous viewpoint should replace all notions of Western wildlife management. Respect this militant resistance and embrace the necessity of civil disobedience. What right isn't always legal and vice versa? Consider getting arrested. Who and what is at risk? If past extinctions provide guidelines, then it's all life larger than a small meadow mouse. Now I can unpleasantly anticipate being among those minority humans left on earth to die from old age. I'd be happy if everyone could. It's a scourge of my geeserhood. I am unconcerned with my own death and fatally engaged in the lives of all my survivors. There's a bottomless, contradictory sadness in a fleeting glimpse of justice. Nature bats last, avenging the scorched earth, payback to Homo sapiens, bundled up in the loss of beauty and suffering in the lives of the people you love most. But then I watched a glacier grizzly walking slowly through a herd of elk that paid him nor mind nor got out of his way. And I go on for about a page and a half of those experiences. And once taking Doug Seuss to the Grizzly Hill, and the two of us watching a circle of friends tightly gather around a small water hole. 4 swaying adult mother grizzlies, 4 bear cubs, a yearling, and 2 subadult grizzly bears, a prior litter of one of the moms. Science doesn't admit this spectrum of behavior. The bears were dancing. It was worth it.
She answered the question.
Yeah, finally.
I'm telling you that that book is wonderful, and as is everything you write. And I highly recommend everybody buy 10 copies a piece, I would say. But looking back at everything you've done, you can pick the order here. But can you say one of the things you're most proud of, and that you've managed to accomplish with the help of your team and with everybody that surrounds you? And then, is there something that just eats at you, like that you may have come up short on that maybe fuels your work today?
The only thing I regret is, not being able to raise enough money to perpetuate, Save the Yellowstone Grizzly. Mm-hmm. I'll work on that. But the writing of books came accidentally. I didn't seek out to become a writer. I never practiced. I've never had a writing course in my life.
You're making me feel bad.
I've never stared at a blank piece of paper. I just, when a book comes along, I start at the beginning and type till the end.
See, I'm trying to write something right now, and I'm banging my head against the wall. I need to just lighten up and do it. Just sit down.
And I have to wait years sometimes.
Does it boil around in your head? And then okay.
And it's like a really bad cold that kind of festers around until it kicks your butt.
It's got to come out.
It's got to come out. Yeah.
And you wrote this one fast, right?
Yeah. Well, I was getting old, so I didn't know how much time I had left. And there was, it was during the pandemic, so I thought I'd probably catch something and croak, But none of that hurts you, really. That's been a blessing because the books are not bad. I've reread them mostly. And, I'm glad that happened. I got a lot of literature awards for this last one.
It's wonderful. And again, maybe I need to quit being self-centered, but it makes me jealous because I read that. I'm like, there's no way I can do this. You just got to do my own thing.
Yeah, well, Andy says she can tell my reading because we're going through my trash, which is, if you're lucky, you can sell its archives,
Oh, yeah.
They come in and take all your garbage and box it up and take it away and send you a big check. And I'm broke again, so I got to do that. And she says she can tell what I wrote and other people wrote. I got a lot of correspondence in there.
We already spoke about this briefly, but I'm very curious about your friendship with Jim Harrison because you guys were obviously super tight, but it seems like you're very, very different in a lot of ways as well.
No, that's for sure. But I did take him camping when no one else, did, and. Because he was older than me, and he never let me forget it.
Yeah.
So was Abbey, but it wasn't quite as bad with Jim. Douglas, he'd say.
Well, I found a video of you giving a kind of a tribute online, giving a tribute to Jim Harrison soon after he had died. And there was some part in there where you said you had to help him get the belt of his backpack under his gut.
In Mexico. I had to hook. It's the only time I've ever known Jim to put a backpack on, and I had to hook the belt below his considerable belly.
What did you learn? Like, what did you take from that friendship? Like, what did you get from Jim Harrison?
He had a good sense of beauty in nature. He was such a wonderful poet, and when he was on, the Legends of the Fall and Dolph are just fantastic pieces of literature. Mm-hmm. Works of genius almost.
Well, it's interesting seeing all these different circles of people from your generation, because there was the whole Key West crowd of Harrison and McGuane and all and Hunter S. Thompson, and then there's you and Edward Abbey, and then there's Chenard and Tompkins, and I don't know, I wonder where that stuff is happening now.
Well, I think the energy was contagious all around, and despite the spats that came out of the aggregation of egos, there were challenges that made everybody a little better artist. Mm-hmm. That's good. You should count on your friends for things like that.
What's giving you hope these days?
Just that we're still fighting, and that includes my friends too. Like Chenard, he's not going to quit until he's 6 feet under or whatever.
There's a quote I saw that I've seen him had said before, but I was reminded from one of your videos. He says, the cure for depression is action. Don't get depressed, get angry, do something about
it. Perfect.
And I think
Abbey would say exactly the same damn thing.
Really?
Yeah.
It's so easy, especially with this damn internet, to sit around and get all upset about shit. And you just got to, every time, I remember one time I was feeling kind of down in the dumps, and I went in my backyard and cleaned up dog shit for 30 minutes, and I felt so much better.
Yeah,
and I was cleaning up dog shit's better than...
I get bailed out by Andrea, who does the dog shit patrol because it hurts to bend over.
Few more questions for you. I'm always interested in books, obviously, and I'd put yours up there at the top of the list, both everything you've written, but particularly this new one. What's some mandatory reading, say, for somebody like me? I moved to the West from North Carolina when I was 27 and was just exposed to this whole world and just fell in love with it. And a lot of it came through reading.
Well, Desert Solitaire is a place to start. I really liked Barry Lopez's Arctic Dreams just as a piece of writing, though his dreams would have been quite different, Edward Hoagland said, if he'd been camping in a tent in the Brooks Range, and he was on scientific cruises and stuff like that. Annie and Rachel are very, very important, Silent Spring, I mean.
Yes.
And that was inspiration for Terry Tempest Williams, who's carrying on that work today. And there's a guy out at Auburn named Drew Lannon that I'm very fond of. There's a picture of him in my book, I see.
Drew Lanham?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's at Clemson.
Clemson.
I've interviewed him. He's awesome. I love his work.
Yeah, he's something else. And, he's pioneering new things. I know I was going through here. Oh, there's a picture of me and Drew.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah. It's just the back of our heads in Montana.
He's a great guy. And he's a hard worker too, man.
Man, isn't he?
He doesn't slow down.
Yeah.
Those are excellent. And
and there's lots of people writing today that are, that are reaching for that sky, and it's in all our interest.
Well, it's a real honor to get to share this hour with you, and I really appreciate everything you've done. I mean, I know you hear that everywhere you go, but
not everywhere.
but thank you, really, thank you for all the work you've done, and I hope we can stay in touch. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.